computer.
Cindy's not here.
Oh, yeah, that's not.
She always reminds us to record it.
Yeah, there we go.
When she's not here, we're on our own.
There you go. Okay, so we are on week 18 and the last week of our study of John. And we're going to try to do three things today, and that is give a little picture of John as a person, if you will, but also do chapter 21, and then also review and do some highlights on some of the really important messages in the book of John.
Yep, we've got some review highlights, things we don't want to let go. Can I real quick, just there's always a purpose to this, you know, obviously, but what I've found over the years is there are things that people don't understand. John says, as we started with, he told all this so that we might believe. And there are things that sometimes when we don't get them or it looks inconsistent and people say, well, I don't know, now I've got doubts. I don't know how I don't know how to reconcile that. And there are some of these things that are actually explainable. I mean, they make sense. A lot of my goal is to try and help people with those things. I don't know why they get lost the way they do over time, but to explain some of the things that cause us to question, that cause us to doubt, and to show you that there's an account here, like in John, that's worthy of your intellect. You don't have to leave your brain behind in order to understand and believe this. And a couple of real quick examples. One of them, we talked about them coming to get Jesus in the garden. And if you go on the internet and search for that, you'll find dozens, if not hundreds, of people telling you that they brought 600 Roman soldiers to take him from the Garden of Gethsemane. And it's a silly thing, it's ridiculous. And if you hear that and don't know the real story, I mean, if someone hasn't said, no, that's, you know, here's why it wasn't that, then you get this idea that they came with overwhelming force and took him away against his will. And there's a, you know, in John, there's a place where he says, I'm the good shepherd. The Father loves me because I lay down my life for my sheep. He says, no one takes it from me. I lay it down willingly. And I tried to bring that up as we went through this study numerous times, but maybe I didn't do a good job of explaining. He actually says so. That's not me. You know, if I'm speculating, I like to tell you, but he makes a point of saying, nobody's taken my life away from me. I'm laying it down willingly. Those stories like 600 Roman soldiers, which is ridiculous. Rome doesn't give 600 soldiers and put them in charge under the control of a few Jewish religious leaders. They just wouldn't do it. And they certainly wouldn't do it without Pilate knowing about it. So I don't know why people tell these stories this way, other than it makes a good story. They have a point they want to make. The history, the account doesn't say that.
And so to remind people what they did do, this is in the middle of the night, and these were more than likely temple guards that came to arrest Jesus. And that makes sense because then they went to Pilate. This idea that 600 soldiers would have come at night is ridiculous. And then you end up,
I think they're probably temple guards, but right. We don't know. But it's one of those things where I say, I don't know what the truth is,
but I know
that's not it. It's not 600. But those things take a toll on people over time. They say, well, you know, he says that he laid his life down, but look, they brought out 600 guards and took him against his will. And it, as John says, I'm telling this stuff so that you can believe. And I've realized through this study, that's really what winds up driving me most of the time, is I know there are things that people think, well, that doesn't seem like it can be true. So should I doubt everything?
And I'll tell you, when I started doing Bible studies, and I didn't study the Bible until my 40s or 50s, I guess, the whole idea of, I was always afraid to dig too deep because I wouldn't be able to answer the question. You know, then than if someone challenged me. But the more we study it, the more I study it, it all goes together. There is an explanation. And that's like you said.
So that's the housekeeping into this. We're going to start on 21. As we said last week, it seemed like John ended really well at what we call chapter 20. And this is almost like an epilogue. And we speculate that maybe some of this was written later than the first 20 chapters. And you're going to see why.
So I'm going to go back to verse 30 on 20, and it says, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So like we were saying, that seems like a pretty darn good ending for the Gospel of John. But then he goes on to chapter 21, and it says, later, by the Sea of Tiberias, Jesus again revealed himself to the disciples. He made himself known in this way. Simon Peter, Thomas called Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. Simon Peter told them, I'm going fishing. We'll go with you, they said. So they went out and got into the boat, but caught nothing that night. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not recognize that it was Jesus. So he called out to them, children, do you have any fish? No, they answered. He told them, cast the net on the right side of the boat and you will find some. So they cast it there, and they were unable to haul it in because of the great number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. As soon as Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he had removed it, and jumped into the sea. The other disciples came ashore in the boat. They dragged in the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and some bread. Jesus told them, bring some of the fish you have caught. So Simon Peter went aboard and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Come have breakfast, Jesus said to them. None of the disciples dared to ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and he did the same with the fish. This was now the 3rd time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead.
So we saw, recent weeks, Jesus gets taken, and thank you. I keep seeing half of my face. I assume the rest of you do too. Jesus is taken, and they gather in the courtyard of Annas, the ex-high priest. But Peter winds up denying his master 3 times. He says,
I haven't gotten to that yet. No, we just did the fish part.
I like to skip ahead. Well, yeah, we did get it. But anyway, I had this conversation with Gene. Peter is, he has 2 speeds. He has run and stop. He does everything that way. And Peter is so gung-ho. He's told Jesus, I'll follow you anywhere. I'll follow you even to death. And that same night he denies it. And we're told in both Matthew and Luke that after that 3rd denial, after he hears the rooster crow and realizes what he's done, he goes outside and weeps bitterly. It hurt him. And what we see in this is he's gone back to Galilee and said, I'm going fishing. Some people are just destroyed by guilt. I've seen people who, get in that situation and they fall away and just say, there's no point now. I've ruined everything. I don't know if Peter was at that point, but certainly he's gone back to Galilee and he says, I'm going fishing. And the other guys go, well, I guess we'll go with you. we see in one of these verses that Peter's out there unclothed. I don't know, maybe he's wearing that undergarment, but it's not a way that most good Jewish boys would go around in public. Peter's sort of hit his limit. There's a point where Jesus had told him, basically, you're going to fall away. This thing is going to be too much for you. But when you return, strengthen your brothers. So what we see is Jesus comes to them in Galilee, and they're out on the boat. And this is so much like what happened in the beginning. And he calls out from the shore. They're only a couple of 100 yards off. It tells us in cubits, but that's pretty close. And he yells out and he says, do you have any fish? And they say, no. That's the whole conversation. And that sounds like real fishermen. I don't know. There's some of you in the audience. I'm not telling you anything. I'm not telling you if I did catch them. And I'm sure not going to have a big conversation about not catching any. And he tells them, throw your net over the other side. This is almost identical to what's happened before. And they catch these fish. And John snaps to it and he says, it's the Lord, it's Jesus. And Peter, he's like Forrest Gump. Peter just immediately dives in and heads for shore. I'm not waiting for anybody. So it is a portrait of Peter. And in it, we see both the impulsiveness, but also the right, maybe instincts. Peter is a character. But anyway, he has, where did you stop?
Well, and they pull up 153 fish.
Yeah, and there's John, 153. If I did catch 153, I'm telling everybody. There's an old joke about that. But John puts these details in. Why? Well, John has told us what he's doing. John says, I'm telling you this stuff so that you might believe. And through believing, have life in him, in his name. And so John includes some of these details, and what he's doing is he's being a witness. He is telling you, the reader, look, I saw this with my own eyes. And I mean, here's details of it.
The charcoal burning fire and having fish for breakfast.
Gene and I had a conversation this week about this, but witnesses in court, if someone says, I saw this with my own eyes, it carries weight with a jury. Now, a lot of people like to say eyewitness testimony is the lowest form of evidence, etc. But the fact is, juries pay attention. If they think you're a credible witness, they listen when you say, I saw this with my own eyes. And that's what John is doing. He's throwing in these things so that you, the reader, may believe. And the 153 fish is just one of them. It seems kind of funny, but I'm going to tell you, if I was fishing and caught 153 fish, I would remember that number. I would tell you. So
when they finished eating, Jesus asked Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he answered, you know I love you. Peter replied, feed my lambs. Jesus asked a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, he answered, you know I love you. Jesus told him, shepherd my sheep. Jesus asked a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was deeply hurt that Jesus had asked him a third time, do you love me? Lord, you know all things, he replied, you know I love you. Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. Truly, truly, I tell you, when you were young, you dressed yourself and walked where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you to where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God.
stop there.
Okay.
I know what you're thinking, but let's stop
Okay.
there. There's a reason.
Okay.
So we see Jesus actually has a meal with them. They prepare fish, bread, and he has this conversation with Peter. And I started with that, reminding you of that episode of the betrayal and how devastated Peter was, because here's Jesus going to him and privately and saying, you know, Simon, do you love me more than these? And I wasn't going to say this actually, but Jean wrote me last night. It seems like an odd thing to say. Do you love me more than these other ones? And I don't know if Peter thinks he does, but you got to leave room for the possibility. Maybe it's true. Peter did everything, fiercely. He messed up.
Fiercely. He loved fiercely.
And so he questions him, says, do you really love me more than these others? Peter has claimed that he does. And he says, yes, Lord. And he says, well, then feed my sheep. Now, you got to remember what I told you a while ago is that he's already told Peter, you're going to fall away. But when you return, not if you return, when you return, strengthen your brothers. So this is Peter's job, and it's been, foretold. He was told it was going to happen, and he comes back and he says, do you really love me like you say? And Peter says, yes. And he says, well, then do what I told you to do. Feed my sheep. Take care of these new believers. And I think ordinarily maybe that's enough, but you remember the three betrayals, the triple betrayal. And so he asked him the same question. And he says, yeah, I already answered that. If you're an attorney, asked and answered, Your Honor, I already said I love you. And he says, then shepherd my lambs.
Shepherd my sheep.
Shepherd my sheep, feed. And there's something going on here. Jean sort of asked me about that too. Feed my sheep, shepherd my sheep, feed my lambs. And they're different words. And people don't use different words unless there's something going on. But I don't know what it is. And there's a lot of speculation, and it's just one of those things. If it's important, I guess it'll be revealed. But there's something going on that's very intensely for Peter. And he's telling him, basically, Peter, you got a job to do. And the repeating it 3 times, nobody misses the fact that it's very much like the 3 betrayals. He got asked, don't you know this guy? Aren't you a follower of this guy? 3 times. And 3 times he says, I never even heard of him. I got nothing to do with him. So this time Jesus reminds him of it. But the thing that I think is beautiful about it is it's not an accusation. It's a reminder for Peter. And he just says, okay, enough feeling sorry for yourself. You got work to do.
It does say Peter was deeply hurt.
Oh yeah, he was hurt. But you think, well, how could he miss that? I don't know. We miss a lot of, but for us, John is telling us that this is, just like the 3 betrayals, he gets asked 3 times, and then Jesus tells him, you got a job to do, Peter. Get off the boat, go do what I told you to do. It's an amazing thing to me because I tell, man, this voice, that there's always a way home. There's always a way back. I've seen people destroyed by guilt over things much less than this, and they just fall away.
Isn't there a lesson in the word love? Peter, do you love me?
Well,
we've already heard people say, I love you, Lord. Da, 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 da. I think the question is loaded. It's more important than your own life, Peter. Do you love me? Even at this stage, but he's already denied it. So the question is, what word was it, and what love is Jesus talking about?
So first of all, I think he's reminding him, you do love me, and you're out here on a boat fishing. It's time to get back. The word was agapeon. It is that selfless agape love, but the purpose in this is to remind Peter and to bring him back. It is the fulfillment of what he said. When you return, strengthen your brothers. But
I like what you said, don't feel sorry, stop feeling sorry for yourself.
Yeah, it is that great thing to us that says when we fail, when we mess up, there's always a way home. It's the prodigal son. He comes back. But is there more to this? Yeah, there really is. It's kind of a
And then that qualifier, more than these, your disciples, your brothers. Peter, do you love me more than your brothers?
it's a topic of a lot of discussion. And all I can say is I have to speculate, but I do think that maybe it's true. Maybe Peter in his way is just more intense. He certainly becomes a leader, the leader for a while of this nascent church. But it's to me, it's just a picture that says we fall away and there's always a way back. There's always a way home. And I think that's, there may be a lot involved, but I think that's the most important thing here.
And after he said this, he told him, follow me. So that was it. Yeah.
Yep, follow me.
Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. He was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper to ask Jesus, who is going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he asked, Lord, what about him? Jesus answered, if I want him to remain until I return, what is it to you? You follow me. Because of this, the rumor spread among the brothers that this disciple would not die. However, Jesus did not say that he would not die, but only, if I want him to remain until I return, what is it? What is that to you? This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who has written them down. And we know that his testimony is true. There are many more things that Jesus did. If all of them were written down, I suppose that not even the world itself would have the space for the books that would be written.
So there's the second half of it. He tells him, feed my sheep, pasture my lambs, that he tells him to take care. And he says, follow me. And you can read a lot into that. What does he mean? I mean, I'd follow in my footsteps, do the things for them that I did for you. At the Last Supper, he tells them the new command, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. And he says, follow me. And you see where he went. And we understand that's sort of exactly what happened to Peter. He followed him pretty precisely, but he's telling him, this is your job. And Peter being Peter, remember, there's a point where Mary read that he says, Peter, when you were young, you dressed yourself and you went wherever you wanted to. But the time is going to come when you get older, when someone else is going to dress you and they're going to lead you where you do not want to go. Peter was martyred. Peter was, we're told, crucified. He follows Jesus' steps in ways that I'm sure he would not have chosen to do. And he tells him that. And it's not, he may not understand that it means to the point of being martyred, of being killed. But Jesus is telling him, follow me, and someone is gonna dress you and take you where you don't want to go. Whatever that means, it's not good. And Peter senses that. I mean, he's gonna be taken by against his will, and something's gonna happen to him. And Peter hears this, and being Peter, he looks over and sees John, ignorance is bliss. And John is not being told he's going to have something happen to him like that. And he looks at him and he says, well, what about him? What about that guy? Well, doesn't he have to do some of this too? And here's this sort of rebuke. This is that is very Peter. And what Jesus tells him is, he's none of your business. If I choose to let him stick around and live until I return, that's my business. It's not your business. You follow me. And I always tell Mary, growing up in Texas, there are all these colorful sayings, and some of them I can't even repeat here, but we have a whole bunch of them. And I remember one where it said, never mind if the horse goes blind, just load the wagon. And you stop worrying about the details. Your job is to load the wagon, just get it done. And that's what he's telling Peter,
Be a sheep.
be a sheep. Yeah, I've told you your job. Don't worry about what I've got in store for John. It's not your path.
Good lesson for the rest of us.
And I think we see that it sticks. This is part of the, development of Peter, because he changes. But it is a rebuke. And sometimes we get those. I do. I don't know about you. I can't say we, but I do. And there's sometimes some pretty harsh messages. Get back to work, knock off what you're doing. And that's what we see in this. John refers to himself in the third person, the disciple who Jesus loved, the one who reclined against Jesus at the Last Supper and all that stuff. And I don't know why it puts some people off. They almost, they think he sounds like he's bragging or whatever. Maybe it's just the truth. John, though, writes this gospel, and it's not his story about him. It is his story about Jesus, about the works for you, for me, so that we may believe. And I always feel like he's kind of extracting himself so that he's not the center of attention. He lets you know, I was there, I saw it, but it's not about me. Some people are really put off by this, but he talks about it. And at the very end, he says, I'm the one. After all of this, third party or third person.
This is a disciple who testifies to these things and who has written them down. And we know that his testimony is true.
So he tells you at the very end. And I just think this is a neat thing, because through this whole gospel, he's referred to himself in the third person. And we get down to the end, and I'm trying to tie this together, from the very beginning. I'm telling you these things so that you might believe. And he gets down to the end, and he's saying, okay, look, I'm the one. I'm the one telling you all this. I'm the one who's written it down. And he goes back to that thing. It's this person who's told you was there. And we know that his testimony is true. He doesn't insert himself more than he has to, but he's telling you, like a witness in court, I saw this with my own eyes, and I'm telling you it's true. And his intent is that carries weight.
Going back a little bit, and this sort of takes us into just a few points about John's life that also makes this make sense. When it says, when it was talking about how Peter was going to die, back up in verse 19, Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. So people say, well, how did they know this? It's believed that Peter died in 62 AD. Okay, so Peter died, 30 years, 20 some odd years after Jesus was crucified. Peter was crucified. John lived to 99, 98, 99, or 100 AD. So John lived 30 years after Peter died. And so John knew how Peter died. And so that's why I think this last chapter obviously was written after Peter died. And he's like saying, and you know what? That came true too. I remember what Jesus said to Peter. Peter told me, and that is how he died.
So one of the other things we get out of that last section, this sort of rebuke to Peter, he says, if I choose to let him stay until I return, what is that to you? Why is that your business? John lives to a ripe old age, but I want you to look at what happened. John tells us what happened. He says,
because of this, the rumor spread among the brothers that this disciple would not die. However, Jesus did not say that he would not die, but only if I want him to remain until I return. What is that to you?
So there you go. Jesus uses this to teach Peter a lesson. He says, hey, look, if I choose to let him live forever, that's my business. If he stays alive until I return, it's my business. But people heard that and started this rumor. They start this myth that in fact, Jesus had said John would never die. How does that happen? And I think sometimes some of these things, like what I mentioned with the Roman soldiers a while ago, I know some people have got to wonder, well, if that's true, how come nobody's ever told me that before? How come what you're saying is different from if I go to the internet and put it in, they'll say it was 600 soldiers. And I wonder that too. I wonder it all the time. Why are people teaching things that I can look right there and it says something different? And here's an example. Jesus is teaching Peter a lesson and he says, if I decided to let him live forever, that's my business. And people took that and turned it into a myth that John wouldn't die. And John himself says, I'm putting this in so you'll know that's not what happened. That's not what Jesus said. He didn't say I wouldn't die. He just said if he chose to let me live however long, he could, and it's his business. I don't know why people feel sometimes this compulsion.
Makes a better story.
It makes a better story. I mean, it's like they say in golf, you know, nobody claps for a good layup. They want you to go for it. They want something big and exciting, and they clap for that. There's a lot of this stuff that I got taught, and I look back and I go, you know what? It says right there something totally different. Where did you get that? This is a good example, and John is showing us that it started from the very beginning.
And I want to give you time to go back to do the highlights, but some of the things just to know about John, to keep in mind that it makes the way he tells the Gospel of John makes sense. One of the things that I thought thinking about this whole study of John was that we seem to make Jesus so human that sometimes we don't respect his deity. And how do we do that? We act like Jesus was put to death and it wasn't his will. So that whole story,
He's just a guy.
He was just a guy. On the other hand, what do we do with the disciples? We make them almost godlike, and that they're, you know, just one step below Jesus. These disciples were people, were just ordinary people. And they had some of the same struggles and doubts that we have. And I think that's what we're supposed to hear. But instead, we put them up on this pedestal and we lose some of the humanness of these people. So a couple of things to remember of John. When John was called by Jesus, they believe he was somewhere between the ages of 16 and 19 years old. He was the youngest disciple, you guys. He was the baby of this clan. His big brother was James. And, you know, one of the things I said early on, I had an idea that all the disciples were buddies, and, you know, they weren't. They came from different areas, but there were four that probably, some of this is speculation, but that probably knew each other. And that was Peter and his brother Andrew and James and John. They all grew up as fishermen. James and John were the sons of Zebedee. That was their father. He had a fishing business. His mother was Salome. I think those are important things to know. I think that, remember, James and John, younger brother and older brother, they were called the sons of thunder. Why were they called that? Because they were, you know, they wanted to bring down fire on the Samaritans. And they went to Jesus and said, should we bring down fire on the Samaritans? Remember, they didn't like Samaritans. And, you know, Jesus said, no. That's who John was early on. He was one of these, him
and his brother argued about who was the greatest in Jesus' sight, who's number one. I mean, they were immature.
And this is the same man who wrote the Gospel of John, who wrote first, second, and third John, and who wrote Revelations. Those almost seem like two different people. When you read this gospel, it's such looking back and remembering how everything fit in so you may believe as a reader. So, I mean, it shows that John grew from somebody who was 16 to 18 years old to be a man in his late 80s or early 90s and realized that everything made sense.
He says at that point that Jesus told him that to sort of foreshadow the manner in which Peter would die. And people say, well, you know, how did he know that? The answer is probably at that time he didn't. But keep in mind, Revelation, Mary keeps wanting us to do Revelation, and I don't want to do it. But John is given this revelation, this revealing about what's going to happen far in the future. So the idea that some things may be revealed to him is not that foreign. I mean, you don't have to stretch. So how did he know that that's how Peter was going to die? I don't know, but there's a good chance that this is simply the benefit of hindsight. He's older and he's looking back and he says, you know, I get it now.
Peter was crucified. It made sense exactly what Jesus said. And, you know, one last thing, what happened? I'm like was an Andy Rooney fan. So what's the rest of the story? What happened?
Andy Rooney?
No, what happened to John? Remember, Jesus said to John, looked at John from the cross and said, take care of my mother. You know, we don't have anything in the gospel that tells us. Early church historians pretty much agree that John stayed in Jerusalem and that Mary stayed in Jerusalem until she died. We hear about John a couple of times in Acts, and one time is really funny. I think it's funny or it's ironic. He was, I believe Peter told him to go to Samaria and go preach the gospel to Samaria. So the same man that wanted to bring down fire on the Samaritans years later had to go back and preach to the Samaritans. So I thought that sometimes we're called back to do things we do. And so John did that. What happened to John after Mary died? It is believed that John became the pastor in Ephesus. Remember, Paul went to Ephesus, created a very strong community of believers. And when he left that community of believers, it is believed that John went and pastored that church in Ephesus. Then fast forward, you know, he is the last of the 12 disciples to live. He kept preaching. He did something that somebody didn't like, a Roman officer, the Roman government, and he was exiled to Patmos. We know that to be a fact because in Revelations, in the first chapter of Revelations, it says, I am writing this from Patmos. Patmos is an island off the coast of Greece, and it is where people were sent to. It was like a prison. And he lived in a cave in Patmos and wrote Revelations. What happened after that? Some people say he died in Patmos. Most people believe that whoever sent him to Patmos ended up dying in the Roman government, and he went back to Ephesus. And it is believed that he died in, like I said, 100 AD in Ephesus.
He lived a long time.
I like the rest of the story.
You do.
And it bugs
Was it unusual to die at such a late age? What was it, 96?
Is it unusual now?
No, back then.
No, I'm asking you though. That was my response to you. Is it unusual now?
Yeah, it's very unusual.
It is unusual, and certainly it was no more usual then. A lot of people died younger, but you know, there've always been people who stick around a long time. So I don't think it's what's that? Methuselah, it was an overachiever. On that
I have a
but
question.
yes,
There's always the stories about Mary's home in Ephesus with John.
Oh,
And people who have visited there know it's a big tourist thing.
gotcha.
So if did they die in Jerusalem? What did you just say?
I said
They
you-
lived in Jerusalem.
They lived in Jerusalem, and so all you can look at, there's nothing written in the Bible about this. Early church historians, there are differences. And so there's a good one. Did Mary stay in Jerusalem and die in Jerusalem or go with John to Ephesus? Obviously, there's,
Whoever.
whoever, there's
Turkey,
difference.
I think that's Turkey, right?
Yes, some people believe that she died in Jerusalem. Other people would say she died in Ephesus, but they do believe that John did what he was supposed to do, took care of Mary till she died.
That part seems terribly likely.
Yeah.
After being told by Jesus, this is your mother. My guess is he took it really seriously and took care of her like she was his own mother. So I want to go over a few things. We're finally closing this one out. It's been a long time, but there's some things that I'd kind of like to leave people with if we can. The beginning, the opening to John is beautiful. It's poetry, but it is, it's an amazing lesson explanation. I had this idea I was going to read it in a voice, and as you can see, I don't have much of a voice. So, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. But here we go. It begins, this gospel begins, in the beginning was the Word. And I've told you that is logos. It is this belief that there is some overarching logic, truth. And truth is important in the universe that makes everything tie together and makes it make sense. And John is saying, there is. And in the beginning was the Logos. And the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. Now, it says he was with God in the beginning. And here's this first hint of this sort of impossibility to us. He describes them as separate, and yet he says he was with God and he was God. And he's clearly talking about Jesus, about Messiah, about the Son. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. He was with God in the beginning, and it is the beginning of everything that we also can't understand. Through him, all things were made, and without him, nothing was made that has been made. He was a part of the construction of all of this. I don't know if many of you have any idea how big a galaxy is. Our galaxy. It is unfathomably big from one edge to the other. The amount of time that light takes to travel is years. And yet they set these telescopes like Hubble, and they look out into the darkest places once they focus out there, they find nothing but more and more galaxies. The place is unbelievably huge, unfathomably huge. And it says he was there at the beginning of all of it. And this is something that I think, and John makes a theme of this, but he says, in him was life. And it is not just the idea that we get up and walk around because we're alive. It is an idea that is much deeper than that. The origin, the source, the reality of life. In him was life, and that life was the light of men, the light of the world. And John takes that over and over, and we see Jesus in his teachings talking about the light. And this is something way beyond daylight that we see. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Overcome, we think, is beaten down, but this one has more to do with, it hasn't encompassed it. The light is greater than the darkness. And it says that the light is this life that exists in him. The true light who gives light, well, he talks about John testifying to the light, but the true light, and you hear that word true, John makes that a theme. Jesus makes that a theme about truth. Later on, we see a Samaritan woman at a well, and he tells her, he's talking to her, and she says, your people said we aren't allowed to worship here. We have to go to Jerusalem. And he tells her that the time is coming, and in fact is already here, when you're going to worship in spirit and in truth. And that word truth just keeps coming back up. You're going to worship in spirit and in truth. And I probably should do it justice with reading it. He says, the true believers. And I spent a lot of time on that word true, the way it gets used. And it has to do with more than me saying, you know, my shirt is blue, or that's a truth. It's not a falsehood. This has to do with the kind of overarching truth that we think about in Logos. And he tells this woman, the true believers or the true worshipers will worship in spirit and in truth. And John just hammers this home about truth over and over again. Jesus talks about truth. And so flash forward, he's in front of Pilate, and he says, for this reason, I came to testify to the truth. And he says that all those who belong to the truth, listen to me. And I pointed out to you a couple of weeks ago that odd phrasing. It's not unique. You know, when we were in Israel, they talk about taking a decision as if the decision is already there. I just have to pick one. Belonging to the truth is backwards from what we think. We think the truth belongs to us. And I don't think that's an accident of phrasing that he tells Pilate, all those who belong to the truth, listen to me. And do you remember Pilate's response? What is truth? What do I care? What's Logos? All there is power. All there is now. All there is, you know, I can make you jump like a puppet if I want to because I'm powerful. What is truth? What do I care about truth? You want truth? That's yours. I'll give it to you. The meek shall inherit the earth. Fine. You can have it when I'm done with it. Inherit it. Knock yourself out. These things come up in the Bible, in, you know, Jesus teaching, these contradictions almost, but we see the truth all throughout it. And then we see him almost closing with this idea that I'm here to testify to the truth. Some people care about it. Some people don't. It's a good reminder. There's, do we need to quit?
No, you have one more.
So I'll read one more. In this opening, in chapter 1, John says, the word, the Logos, became flesh. And that's how we know when he says Logos, he's talking about Jesus, because he says the Logos became flesh and made his dwelling among us. But if you read that in the original, it's actually a word that is tabernacled. You know, we read the Bible and we hear this thing about tabernacles, a tent, a temporary building, that's a tabernacle. And John gives us this picture, this idea that he occupied a tent of flesh. He was more than that, but he came and dwelt among us. He tabernacled in this body to be with us. We have seen his glory. We have seen his glory. And they saw him, you know, resurrected. But we have seen his glory of the one and only Son. That means more than just Son. It means this uniqueness. But the one and only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Always this truth that he has. John, that would be John the Baptizer, testified concerning him. He cried out saying, this is he of whom I said, he who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me. John told people, I'm here to point you to the truth. I'm here to point you to him, but he surpassed me because he existed long before I came here. Now this last bit, probably not a bad place to end it. This is still from the first chapter of his gospel, talking about this Messiah who came and tabernacled with us. From his fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. For the law, and this fullness and the grace, it's more of this, that's more of the same thing. From his fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ, came through the Messiah. Grace and truth. And grace is a word that means undeserved favor. It is a thing that is bestowed. It is, Gene, from the Old Testament has said. It is this undeserved favor poured out on someone who has nothing to offer back. Grace and truth, the law came from Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is at the Father's side, has made him known. John tells us he came and testified to the truth. He came and revealed God, whom no one has ever seen, in a way that would be real to us. That was the Logos. John's gospel, at the end, he tells us, I'm going to tell you things that'll help you believe. I'm going to tell you things that will allow you to believe. There's a lot more. If I told you everything, there wouldn't be time, there wouldn't be enough paper for me to write it on. But I'm going to tell you these things. And we see that theme of grace and truth and life and light. And I didn't have time, but Jesus' words echo life and light. I'm the light of the world. Nobody has to walk in darkness. The light will only be with you a short time. While you have the light, walk in the light. This theme is there for a reason. And I would recommend, if you get back around to reading this, don't leave those parts out. Remember those themes. Testify to the truth. From him we've received grace after grace upon grace, and walk in the light while he's with us. Anything else?
I'm going to give a teaser for next week.
So that's the whole purpose, 1 through 16, right at the opening.
Yes, it
That
is.
the rest of this gospel is giving us examples. And some work and some don't.
Different people, and I think you're right, Jim. Glad I mentioned it, but I'll mention it one last time, is that different people hear different things. We approach this place differently, and we're meant to be that way. We think differently, we feel differently, and there are different examples through there. And some people will read one or two of them and go, man, that really talks to me. And then they look at other ones and go, I don't know what he's talking about, or that just sort of leaves me flat. I hear this stuff all the time. That just sort of leaves me flat. Well, yeah, but somebody else, that was a hard lesson for me, that the parts that sing to me, and I'll tell somebody, expecting them to go, oh man, I see what you're saying. And they look at me like I'm talking Martian. Well, it's supposed to be that way. And John, it's like he pioneered a management degree. He knows you have to manage different people different ways. And he gives us different examples that speak to different people. And I think it's a beautiful thing. I mean, it's a very beautiful piece of work that he does. But yes, you summed it up. It's there to believe, and he gives us different things for different people. Yep.
Next week?
Next week, as we said, Ecclesiastes. I don't know if anybody is truly free of having looked around and said, is this all there is? I mean, that's all I get, or that's all that happens. I mean, I'm not gonna, there's nothing bigger than this. And a lot of people get lost down that rabbit hole, just like I mentioned with Peter. I've seen people fall away because they think if there was really a God, there'd be more than this. There would be, and you can see through this book of Ecclesiastes how people get there. And Solomon had everything,
And he still asks the question.
And he still winds up, I would say, depressed. And this, depression that comes with and you see in his father David saying, if you're lucky, you live to be 70, maybe 75 or 80, but we all wither like the grass in summer. And people reach a point where contemplating their own mortality. My dad reached that point and it depressed him. And it's not a good way to live. And so we're going to look at this and see it in action. And sometimes it's easier to see someone else than to see ourselves in these situations. So we're going to look at that, but at the same time, hopefully along the way, we get some clues about maybe how to avoid it, how to pull yourself out.
Okay.
God, you know our hearts. You know that we love you. You know that it's important. And yet, like Peter, sometimes we fail. Sometimes we lose sight of that fact. And we count on you to come back and remind us, to show us, that we have a job to do. We have a part in this plan that you have. And even when we fail, you offer us a way back. You present us with a way home. And we're thankful for that. Never let us forget it. Amen.
You guys can unmute yourselves. Let's see. This is weird. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. That was excellent.
Yay. Yeah. And if you know people that want to join us next week when we start a new one, because I know people don't like to come halfway through, ask someone to come join us, either in
I
person.
saw someone, Virginia, on your phone. I saw.
There you go. There you go. Hi. And the timing, of sending the rooster was great. Especially since we got to talk about Peter, and it's so great to remember. I want you guys to see it one more time. And if you can see the shadow of Peter in the back, I think that's just very neat.
Bob, Julie, sometimes we look at these things and we pray for whatever God has in store for him and for Ben. This time, we just want to see him feel better. It's healing.
Thank you. Yeah. Isn't that neat?
Jack, how are you? I didn't really get to speak. I was working on computers today.
Oh, you're muted. You're still muted.
You're muted.
Yeah.
I can't unmute.
Yeah. There you go. There we go. There you go.
There.
You're doing good?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, you guys have a good week.
The dark is too dark.
Oh, the floor, okay. They're deciding on our flooring.
If you were here in person, you can help us pick flooring. We're opening it up to the group.
Scott, thanks for getting all that work done, getting the internet set up again for us. When I first tried to log on, it looked like we were, doomed for a little bit, but you got it fixed. Thanks.
Yes. Yes.
It's, always just in a nick of time. What happened?
Yes,
And
yes.
I always feel guilty about these things, but I worked on this room. Gene, I'll call you. I worked on this room and I had to take things apart. I painted the walls and I had to just take it all apart. And it should have been a no-brainer. It should have been all I had to do was plug it back together. And it's a computer and it didn't agree. So, and even last, I was up till 2 and I thought I had it. And then I came in this morning and so anyway, is the sound echoey today? Is the sound loud enough and is it echoey?
It was good when you guys were talking. It was fun. It was good. I mean, there for a minute we heard a lot of, and now we're hearing, a number of voices, but I mean, you guys did a good job. You did great. And yeah, I could tell you were under tremendous pressure there to get it going again.
No, there's a whole lot of pressure when you have a whole bunch of people waiting. I always, in my business life, I always prepared way ahead of time. I never came to a meeting, without it. And to show up and have people waiting on you and say, oh, gee, sorry, technical difficulties. I tell Mary all the time, I would fire myself.
We're not
Yes.
firing you, Scott. You're
No,
not,
no,
you don't get out that easy.
You're not getting away from us.
Well,
No.
that's me, but I hate the thought. So I appreciate the patience, but we got it.
Okay. All right. Goodbye.
We love you, Scott.
Bye, Cheryl.
Yes,
Carrie,
yes, we
Rob.
do.
Sitting there liking this one better.